Imagine spending 12 years behind bars for something you didn't do. Not because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, not because there was solid evidence against you, but because the system decided you were guilty before you even had a chance to prove otherwise. Your freedom? Gone. Your dreams? Shattered. Your family? Left watching helplessly as the world turned its back on you. That's exactly what happened to Elijah Hayes. A hardworking man, a son, a brother turned into a criminal overnight. The jury barely deliberated. The evidence? Flawed. His lawyer didn't even fight for him. And just like that, he was thrown into one of the toughest prisons in the country, branded as something he never was. But here's where the story takes a turn they never saw coming. Because Elijah didn't let the system break him. He studied the very laws that failed him. He uncovered the truth they buried. And when he finally walked free, he didn't just move on. He made it his mission to fight for others like him. This is not just a story about injustice. This is a story about resilience, about refusing to stay silent, about a man who turned his pain into power. And trust me, by the time you hear what he did next, you won't believe how this ends. The air in East Haven was thick that night, the kind of heavy summer heat that made the asphalt radiate warmth long after the sun had set. Streetlights flickered lazily, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. The hum of distant car engines blended with the occasional laughter of teenagers gathered outside corner stores, their voices bouncing off the graffiti-covered brick buildings. It was just another night in the neighborhood, until it wasn't. Elijah Hayes wiped the grease from his hands, tossing the stained rag onto the metal workbench in his uncle's auto shop. The place smelled like oil, rubber, and hard work, a scent Elijah had grown up with. It was nearly midnight, and he should have gone home hours ago, but work had a way of keeping him grounded. He loved cars, their predictability, the way every broken part had a solution. Machines made sense. Life didn't. He pulled off his coveralls, revealing the sweat-soaked tank top underneath, and grabbed his backpack. As he stepped out into the humid night, he exhaled slowly, letting the exhaustion settle into his bones. Home was just a few blocks away. He took the same route he always did, down Sycamore Street, past Manny's Deli, then left onto Maple Avenue. He didn't see the cop cars at first. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the store windows, painting the pavement in streaks of urgency. A small crowd had gathered outside a liquor store, murmuring in hushed tones. The glass door hung open, shattered, a spiderweb of cracks running through the window beside it. Elijah slowed his steps. The tension in the air was palpable. Then came the sirens. A second patrol car screeched around the corner, tires burning against the road. A voice boomed from a speaker. "Stop right there! Hands where we can see 'em!" Elijah froze, his stomach clenched. A lifetime of lessons from his mother echoed in his head. Don't run. Don't argue. Don't move too fast. Before he could say a word, two officers rushed toward him, guns drawn. "Get on the ground, now!" "What? No, I..." A knee hit the small of his back before he could finish. His face slammed into the pavement, rough asphalt scraping his cheek. Heavy hands yanked his arms behind him, wrists twisted into cold steel cuffs. The pain barely registered past the shock. "I didn't do anything." Elijah gasped, his breath ragged. "Yeah? Tell it to the judge." The officers hauled him to his feet, his head spun. The faces in the crowd blurred together, some watching in silence, others shaking their heads. A woman whispered, "That's not him," but no one spoke up loud enough to matter. His heart pounded as they shoved him into the back of the squad car. The world outside was distorted through the dirty glass, the flashing lights making everything surreal. In the distance, an ambulance pulled away from the scene. A body on a stretcher, blood smeared on the sidewalk, a robbery gone wrong, and they thought he did it. The interrogation room was a suffocating box of stale air and buzzing fluorescent lights. Elijah sat with his hands cuffed to the table, his fingers gripping the cool metal. His mind raced. He had asked for a lawyer, but none had come yet. Detective Harris, a burly man with graying temples, leaned forward, his breath reeking of coffee and impatience. "Let's go over it again. Where were you at 11:45 p.m.? "I told you. I was at my uncle's shop." Harris scoffed, flipping through a thin folder. "Funny, 'cause we got two witnesses saying they saw someone matching your description running from the scene." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Matching my description? 6-foot black male, dark hoodie, jeans. Elijah laughed, but there was no humor in it. So basically, half the men in East Haven? Harris leaned in closer. We also found a witness who claims they saw you arguing with the victim earlier this week. That's a lie, the detective smirked. We'll let the jury decide. They didn't find his fingerprints at the crime scene. They didn't find a weapon. The surveillance footage was grainy, the suspect's face blurred beyond recognition. But none of that mattered. The prosecution spun a story convincing enough to sway a jury, one that painted Elijah as an angry young man with a chip on his shoulder, the kind who'd snap over something as petty as an argument. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict came down like a hammer: guilty. His mother's cry echoed through the courtroom, a sound so raw it made his chest ache. He turned to her, eyes burning, but the guards moved too fast, already pulling him away. His world faded to cold steel and concrete. Blackridge Penitentiary awaited. The courtroom smelled of old wood and cheap coffee, a stale mix of history and exhaustion. The ceiling fan spun lazily, pushing around the heavy air, but nothing could clear the suffocating weight pressing against Elijah's chest. He sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His lawyer, Mark Ellison, flipped through a thin folder, barely glancing at him. Elijah had seen public defenders in movies, sharp suits, quick minds, fighting for their clients with fiery determination. Mark was none of that. His tie was loose, his eyes tired, his shoulders slumped under the weight of too many cases and not enough time. "All right, listen," Mark muttered, still flipping through pages. They offered a plea deal, 15 years out and 10 with good behavior. Elijah's stomach twisted. "A plea deal? I didn't do anything." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "I hear you, but juries don't care about that. They care about what the prosecution puts in front of them." Elijah shook his head, his pulse hammering. "I'm not signing something that says I did it." Mark exhaled sharply. "Then we fight." He shut the folder and finally looked at Elijah, his expression unreadable. "But I'll be honest with you. You're a black man in a courtroom with an all-white jury. The DA's office is pushing this case hard. It's going to be an uphill battle." Elijah swallowed, but his throat felt like sandpaper. He turned, searching the benches behind him. His mother, Lorraine, sat in the second row, her hands clasped in prayer, lips moving in silent pleas. His little sister, Ava, barely 19, clung to her mother's arm, eyes wide with fear. They believed in him. They knew the truth. But would that be enough? The bailiff's voice rang through the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Whitaker." A tall, silver-haired man in a black robe entered, his face void of expression. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the courtroom with weary detachment. And just like that, the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time painting Elijah as a violent man, a ticking time bomb. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the DA, Richard Vaughn, began, pacing slowly. He was a man in his mid-50s, with a voice that carried confidence and an arrogance that filled the room. "This case is simple. Elijah Hayes was seen near the crime scene. Witnesses identified him, and most importantly, he turned, lifting a piece of paper. We have sworn statements that he had a motive." He let that sink in before placing the paper on the evidence table. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was anger. This was revenge. Elijah tensed. That was a lie. There was no motive. There was no connection to the victim. His lawyer stood, straightening his wrinkled jacket. "Objection. The prosecution is making claims without." The judge waved a dismissive hand. "Overruled. Continue." Mark sighed, rubbing his forehead. Elijah clenched his jaw. The prosecution brought in their so-called witnesses. People Elijah had never met before, faces he didn't recognize. "I saw him running," one man claimed. "He looked nervous," a woman added. "He's the guy, no doubt." Every word felt like a punch to the gut. Then came the worst part, the so-called evidence. A blurry surveillance video played on the screen. The courtroom lights dimmed as the grainy footage flickered to life. A man in a hoodie ran from the scene, disappearing into the night. The image was so distorted it could have been anyone. Vaughn turned dramatically to the jury. "Look at that frame, the height, the build, it matches the defendant." Elijah leaned forward. "That's not me," he muttered under his breath. The DA wasn't done. He pulled up a statement from a detective who had interviewed a supposed witness. And let's not forget, Vaughn continued, we have testimony that Mr. Hayes was overheard threatening the victim days before the crime. Elijah's blood turned to ice. That was an outright lie. His lawyer stood again, looking more irritated than determined. Objection, this is hearsay. The judge glanced at Vaughn, then back at Mark. Sustained, the jury will disregard that statement. But Elijah knew better. The words were already planted in their minds. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the jury. They weren't looking at him anymore. A few shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze. The damage was done. Mark barely put up a fight. He questioned the reliability of the witnesses, but the prosecution countered every argument with prepared responses. He pointed out the lack of DNA evidence, but Vaughn spun it into a narrative about criminals knowing how to cover their tracks. When it was time for Elijah to testify, Mark advised against it. They'll twist everything you say, he warned. But Elijah refused to stay silent. Taking the stand, he met the jury's eyes one by one. I didn't do this, he said, his voice firm but steady. I was at my uncle's shop that night. I didn't know the victim. I didn't threaten anyone. He hesitated, inhaling deeply. I just want to go home. For a brief moment, the courtroom was silent. Then Vaughn stepped forward. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, he said smoothly, have you ever been in trouble with the law before? Elijah's stomach dropped. No, but you've had encounters with the police, haven't you? Elijah clenched his fists. I've been stopped before, yeah, but never arrested. Vaughn turned to the jury, raising an eyebrow. Stopped before. Interesting. Elijah knew what he was doing. He was planting seeds, suggesting that because Elijah had been questioned before, something nearly every black man in his neighborhood had experienced, he must be the kind of person who belonged in this courtroom. When the cross-examination ended, Elijah sat back down, gripping the edge of the table. His lawyer gave him a weak nod, but it wasn't reassuring. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The wait felt like an eternity. Elijah sat between his lawyer and a guard, staring at the empty defense table as whispers filled the courtroom. His mother and sister sat behind him, holding hands. Then, the bailiff spoke. Jury has reached a verdict. Elijah stood, his legs shaking. The foreman, an older man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. On the charge of first-degree robbery and assault, we find the defendant guilty. The air was sucked out of the room. Elijah barely registered his mother's sobs. He barely felt the bailiff gripping his arm. He barely heard the judge's words as he sentenced him to 25 years in Black Ridge Penitentiary. All he knew was that his life was over. The walls of Black Ridge Penitentiary were taller than Elijah ever imagined. They loomed over him like silent judges, topped with razor wire that gleamed under the harsh morning sun. The cold steel gates clanked open, and the heavy chains around his wrists and ankles rattled as he took his first steps inside. A guard nudged him forward. Welcome home, Hayes. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat, but the bitterness lingered. This is not my home. The intake process was dehumanizing. Strip, squat, cough, shower under water so cold it burned. A guard tossed him an orange jumpsuit, stiff and scratchy. He caught it with numb fingers. They handed him a mattress, thin as paper, a blanket that smelled of mildew, and a plastic cup. That was all he owned now. The cell block was louder than he expected. Voices echoed off concrete walls, a mix of laughter, arguments, and the occasional shout of a guard barking orders. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and something stale, like the scent of hopelessness had seeped into every inch of the building. Elijah's new home was cell 214. The metal door slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing a space barely larger than a closet. A single bunk bolted to the wall, a toilet with no privacy. Faded etchings of names and messages carved into the walls by men who had come before him. Get in, the guard muttered. Elijah stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence was suffocating. He sank onto the thin mattress, running a hand over his face. His fingers brushed against the bruises left from the struggle in court, from the handcuffs digging into his wrists. His mother's face flashed in his mind, the way her body shook with silent sobs as the verdict was read. His sister, Ava, her hands clasped in front of her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. And then there was the jury. The way they hadn't looked at him as the foreman spoke the word guilty. As if they knew they were condemning an innocent man but had decided it wasn't their problem. A sudden rage surged through him. He gritted his teeth and slammed his fist against the wall. The pain barely registered. First time inside, Elijah looked up. A man stood outside his cell, leaning against the bars. He was older, mid-50s, with deep lines on his face and eyes that had seen too much. His jumpsuit read R. Lawson, inmate 08742. Elijah hesitated. Yeah, Lawson nodded as if he already knew. Let me give you some advice. Don't talk too much. Don't make too many friends. And whatever you do, he glanced down the row of cells, then back at Elijah. Don't owe nobody nothing. Elijah studied him. You been here a long time? Lawson smirked. Long enough to know a dead man walking when I see one. Elijah's stomach turned. I'm not dead. The older man gave a slow nod. Not yet. Then he pushed off the bars and walked away, disappearing into the sea of orange jumpsuits. Elijah exhaled, pressing his back against the cold wall. His fingers curled into fists. I don't belong here. But it didn't matter, because here, truth wasn't currency. Power was. The first few weeks were the worst. Elijah learned fast. Learned that mealtime was a battleground, that every stare could be a challenge, that the guards weren't there to protect you, just to keep the chaos contained. He kept his head down, moved when he was told, stayed quiet. But quiet didn't mean invisible. One afternoon in the yard, Elijah was leaning against the fence, watching the world move beyond the razor wire, when a shadow loomed over him. New guy. Elijah turned. A broad-shouldered man stood before him, his muscles stretching against his jumpsuit. His arms were covered in tattoos, prison ink, faded and rough. A scar sliced across his left cheek. Name's Cruz, the man said. Elijah stayed silent. Cruz grinned, but there was nothing friendly about it. I see you've been keeping to yourself. That's smart, but you're gonna need protection. Elijah's jaw tightened. I don't need anything from you. Cruz chuckled. See, that's where you're wrong. You're fresh meat. You don't got a crew, don't got nothing to trade. He took a step closer. So here's the deal. You're with me now. That means when I need something, you get it. When I got a problem, you handle it. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of other eyes on them. You don't get to say no, Cruz added, his voice dropping lower. Elijah's hands curled into fists, a voice cut through the tension. Cruz. The older inmate from before, Lawson, was standing a few feet away, watching them. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. Cruz glanced over, his expression shifting slightly. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled through his nose. Fine, guess we'll talk later. He turned and walked away. Elijah looked at Lawson. You didn't have to do that. Lawson shrugged. You'll learn soon enough. Ain't no such thing as a free favor in here. Elijah frowned. So why'd you step in? A slow smile. Because I've been watching you, kid, and I see something different. That night, Elijah lay on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the trial, the lies, the way the system swallowed him whole without a second thought. And then he thought about Lawson, about the way the man carried himself, the quiet authority he had, and he thought about what he had said. I see something different. Elijah didn't know what that meant yet, but one thing was clear. If he was going to survive this place, he couldn't just exist. He had to fight. The sound of metal doors slamming echoed through the cell block, a sharp, unforgiving reminder that Elijah Hayes was exactly where they wanted him to be, caged. Days in Blackridge Penitentiary bled into each other, blending into a cycle of silence, survival, and suffocating routine. Wake up at dawn, stand for count, eat bland food surrounded by men who had already accepted their fate, watch the clock tick away the hours, try not to think about how much time was left. But time had become Elijah's enemy. Every second that passed was a second stolen. Stolen from his mother, from his sister, from the life that was supposed to be his. And yet, no one cared. Blackridge wasn't about correction, it was about containment. And for the first few months, Elijah did exactly what they wanted him to do. He kept his head down. He let the anger simmer inside him, burning just beneath the surface, because he knew that in a place like this, the second you let it out, it would consume you. Then came Lawson. The old man had been watching him since day one, always appearing at just the right moments, pulling him out of trouble, offering quiet advice, keeping him from making the kind of mistakes that could get him killed. One evening, after lockdown, Lawson leaned against the bars of Elijah's cell. You ever wonder why they want you quiet? He asked, his voice calm, like he had all the time in the world. Elijah, sitting on the edge of his bunk, didn't answer. Lawson continued, "Because silence is surrender, and they like you better that way." Elijah looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. "What are you getting at?" Lawson smirked. "I see it in you, kid. That fire. You still think you're getting out of here." Elijah clenched his jaw. "I am." "Then why you acting like you already buried?" Lawson stepped back and motioned toward the hallway. "Come with me." Elijah hesitated but followed. The prison library was one of the only places in Blackridge that felt different. The harsh fluorescent lights still buzzed, and the air still smelled of dust and sweat. But there was something else here too: possibility. The room was small, the shelves old and barely holding together. But they were filled. Thousands of pages bound together, holding information that most of the men inside these walls had never touched. Lawson walked over to a shelf and pulled out a thick book, flipping through the pages before handing it to Elijah. A law book. Elijah frowned, looking at it like it might bite him. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Learn," Elijah huffed, shaking his head. "I'm not a lawyer," Lawson grinned. "Neither was I, but I got close enough." Elijah hesitated, flipping through the pages. The words swam in front of him: legal jargon, complicated sentences, terminology he had never seen before. "I don't even know where to start." "Right here." Lawson tapped the open page. "Your case. Find out how they buried you." Elijah's fingers tightened around the book's edges. For the first time since his sentence, he felt something other than rage. He felt purpose. The days that followed were different. Instead of spending his free time staring at the walls of his cell, Elijah spent every moment he could in the library. At first, it was overwhelming. The words, the loopholes, the endless technicalities that made the law seem like a language meant to be understood by only a privileged few. But Lawson was patient. He showed Elijah how to break it down, how to look for inconsistencies, how to read between the lines of legal documents. And the more Elijah read, the more something became painfully clear. His case was a mess. The so-called witnesses? Unreliable. The evidence? Weak. His lawyer? Barely present. Everything about his conviction reeked of negligence. One night, sitting at a wooden table covered in open books and scattered notes, Elijah rubbed his temples. How the hell did they even get away with this? Lawson leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. Because they could. Because nobody stopped them. Elijah exhaled sharply. "So what do I do?" Lawson chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the wrong question." Elijah looked at him, confused. "You already know what you gotta do," Lawson continued. "The real question is, how bad do you want it?" Elijah thought about his mother, about Ava, about every single moment that had been stolen from him. "I want it," he said, his voice firm. "Then keep reading." Weeks passed, then months. Elijah became obsessed. He studied not just his case, but dozens of others. He learned about wrongful convictions, prosecutorial misconduct, racial bias in the justice system. He learned that his story wasn't unique. Men like him had been getting swallowed by the system for decades. And suddenly, his fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. One night, after lights out, Elijah sat on his bunk, writing furiously on the back of an old case file. His hands were cramping, his vision blurry, but he refused to stop. Because he had finally figured it out. A loophole, a buried piece of evidence, a mistake in the prosecution's timeline that could prove he was innocent. His pulse raced. For the first time since he set foot in Blackridge, Elijah felt something that had been stripped away from him the moment that judge read his sentence. Hope. The hum of the prison lights was constant, a low, buzzing reminder that even in silence, Blackridge was never truly quiet. The air smelled of old paper and dust, the scent of forgotten knowledge buried in the corners of the prison library. Elijah sat at a wooden table, books stacked high around him. His fingers traced over yellowed pages, his eyes scanning the text, absorbing every detail. It had been months, months of reading, of searching, of trying to untangle the twisted mess that had become his life. And finally, he had found something, a gap. It was small, just a few lines buried deep in the trial transcripts, but it was enough to make his pulse quicken, enough to send a wave of possibility crashing through him. He grabbed the file and scanned it again, his heart pounding. The prosecution's entire case had been built on the testimony of a witness, someone who claimed to have seen him fleeing the scene. That statement had been treated like unshakable truth, the foundation of his conviction. But there, in a report he had never seen before, was something that shattered it. The witness had recanted their statement, and no one, not his lawyer, not the jury, not even Elijah himself, had ever been told. Elijah. He looked up, his eyes meeting Lawson's across the table. The older man had been watching him, a knowing look in his gaze. "You look like you just saw a ghost," Lawson muttered, leaning forward. "What'd you find?" Elijah swallowed hard, pushing the document toward him. "Read this." Lawson took it, adjusting the crooked reading glasses perched on his nose. His eyes scanned the page slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Elijah's hands clenched into fists. "They buried this." Lawson nodded. "Sure did." He set the paper down, exhaling. "This ain't new, kid. This system, it don't make mistakes. It makes decisions, and they decided you were easier to throw away than to fight for." Elijah's jaw tightened. The anger was there again, simmering just beneath his skin. "So what do I do?" Lawson smirked, tapping the paper. "You just found your first real shot. Now you fight." Fighting wasn't easy. Elijah had spent years learning the law, but using it was another battle entirely. He filed a motion for post-conviction relief, citing the suppressed evidence as a violation of his rights. The first response came 3 weeks later, denied. Elijah read the rejection letter in his cell, his hands gripping the paper so tightly it nearly tore. "They shut it down," he muttered to Lawson, tossing the letter onto the table. Lawson didn't look surprised. "They always do." Elijah exhaled sharply. "So what now?" Lawson leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "You keep pushing. You ever seen a wall fall from one hit?" Elijah shook his head. "Exactly." Lawson tapped the rejection letter. "So hit it again." And he did. Elijah filed another motion. This time, he included a request for case file access, demanding all original statements and evidence from his trial. Weeks passed, then months. The waiting was the worst part. Knowing the truth, holding it in his hands but being powerless to do anything about it. But Elijah had spent years feeling powerless. He wasn't that man anymore. And then, a letter arrived, stamped with the seal of the Innocence Justice Project. Elijah stared at the envelope in his hands, his pulse hammering. He had written to them months ago, detailing his case, begging someone, anyone, to listen. Slowly, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the first line. "Dear Mr. Hayes, we have reviewed your case and believe there is merit to your claim of wrongful conviction. We would like to discuss potential legal representation." Elijah's breath hitched. For the first time in 12 years, someone believed him. The letter sat on Elijah's lap, the edges crumpled from how many times he had unfolded and refolded it. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous in a place like Blackridge Penitentiary: hope. The Innocence Justice Project was the kind of organization he had read about late at night in the prison library, the kind that fought for men like him, men forgotten by the system, buried under wrongful convictions. And now, they had answered. He took a deep breath, staring at the words again. "We would like to discuss potential legal representation." His freedom wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in 12 years, it felt possible. "Elijah, you got a visitor." The guard's voice snapped him back to reality. He stood quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from his jumpsuit, but his palms were already sweaty. He wasn't used to having visitors. As he stepped into the meeting room, his eyes locked onto the woman sitting at the table. She looked nothing like the lawyers from his trial. No stiff, soulless suit, no rehearsed expressions of fake concern. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with dark brown skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her tight curls framed her face, and her blouse was simple, professional, but not arrogant. She had the look of someone who had seen the system chew up too many people and wasn't afraid to fight back. "Elijah Hayes?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled. He nodded. She stood and extended a hand. "I'm Maya Thompson. I'm here to help you get out of this place." Elijah hesitated for half a second before shaking her hand. No lawyer had ever promised to fight for him before. He just hoped she meant it. They sat across from each other, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "I read your case," Maya started, opening a folder. "I have to say, it's one of the worst mishandlings of justice I've ever seen." Elijah scoffed. "Tell me something I don't know." She smirked. "I also read through the suppression order on your witness statement. She slid a paper across the table. "Whoever buried this wanted to make sure you never saw daylight again." Elijah leaned forward, scanning the document. It was all there: the recanted statement, the missing police report, the detective's notes conveniently misplaced before the trial. The prosecution had built their case on a foundation of lies, and the moment Elijah's public defender stopped fighting, his fate had been sealed. Maya tapped the table. "We can argue prosecutorial misconduct. If we can prove they knowingly withheld evidence that could have changed the outcome of your trial, we can get you back in front of a judge." Elijah exhaled. "And if the judge doesn't care?" Maya met his gaze. "Then we keep fighting." His fingers curled around the edge of the paper. No one had ever said that before. Filing an appeal wasn't simple. Elijah had already submitted 2 on his own, both rejected. The system wasn't built for men like him to challenge their convictions. But this time was different. This time, he had Maya Thompson, a real lawyer, one who believed him. She started with a motion to unseal the missing evidence, forcing the DA's office to acknowledge the files that had been lost all these years. And that's when the real fight began. The prosecution resisted, of course. They argued that the evidence was irrelevant, that Elijah's conviction had been airtight. Maya fired back with case law, legal precedents, and a determination that refused to back down. But Elijah knew better than to think the system would just roll over and admit its mistakes. The state wasn't going to give back the years they stole without a fight. 2 months passed, then 3. Elijah kept himself busy in the library, reading, preparing. Because this time, he wasn't just a prisoner fighting for his life. He was a man who had learned how to wield the law like a weapon. And when the court finally agreed to hear his case, he was ready. The day of the hearing, Elijah stood in a cold courtroom, shackled at the wrists and ankles, dressed in the same orange jumpsuit he had been wearing for over a decade. But this time, he wasn't the same man. The judge, a different one from his original trial, sat high on his bench, flipping through documents with an expression that gave nothing away. Maya stood beside Elijah, her back straight, her voice clear as she laid out every injustice that had led to this moment. The prosecution knowingly withheld evidence that could have exonerated Mr. Hayes, she argued. This is a blatant violation of his constitutional rights. The state's attorney, a younger, cocky man who had nothing to do with Elijah's conviction but was now defending the system that created it, adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, the evidence in question does not change the overwhelming facts of the case," Maya cut him off. "With all due respect, counsel, what facts?" She gestured toward Elijah. "You had no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, a faulty witness ID, and now the only eyewitness has officially recanted their statement. The state put an innocent man behind bars, and it's time to make that right." The courtroom went silent. Elijah could feel the weight of every breath in the room. The judge set down his pen and adjusted his glasses. His expression didn't change, but Elijah didn't miss the way his fingers tapped against the bench, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Then he spoke. "I'll review the motion. No promises, no declarations of innocence, just that." And yet, it was more than Elijah had gotten in 12 years. As they led him back to his holding cell, he turned to Maya. "What now?" he asked. Maya smiled, a glint of fire in her eyes. "Now," she said, "now we make sure they can't ignore you anymore." The air in the holding cell was thick, heavy with a silence that wrapped around Elijah like an iron chain. He sat on the metal bench, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers clasped together so tightly they ached. The walls around him were gray, peeling at the edges, as if time had tried to erase them but failed. But today, time wasn't his enemy. Today, it was his witness. 12 years. 12 long, brutal years since he'd first stepped into Blackridge Penitentiary, wearing shackles he never deserved. 12 years since a jury had stolen his freedom with a single word: guilty. And now, after years of fighting, after uncovering buried evidence, after learning to wield the law like a weapon against the very system that tried to destroy him, he was finally standing at the edge of something that had once seemed impossible. A second chance. The door creaked open. A guard stood there, unreadable. "They're ready for you." Elijah exhaled, slow and controlled as he stood, his hands curled into fists for just a second before he forced them to relax. This wasn't a moment for anger. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The courtroom was different this time. Not physically. It was still the same cold, sterile place where his life had been stolen all those years ago. But the energy was different. Before, when he had sat at the defendant's table, he had been powerless. A man drowning in a system designed to let him sink. Now he sat beside Maya Thompson, the attorney who had refused to let him stay buried. And this time, he wasn't just a man waiting for a verdict. He was a fighter. The judge, an older woman with silver streaks in her dark hair, adjusted her glasses as she shuffled through the stack of documents in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but Elijah had learned to watch the details. The way she tapped her pen against the paper, the way she pressed her lips together, a sign of hesitation, a sign of doubt. And doubt was all he needed. Maya stood, her voice sharp and clear. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. The prosecution knowingly withheld evidence that could have exonerated my client. We have proof that the key witness recanted their testimony, a fact that was never presented to the jury. We have procedural errors, misfiled reports, and a conviction built on nothing but circumstantial evidence." She turned, gesturing toward Elijah. "This man has spent 12 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. The state failed him, and now it has a chance to make it right." Elijah clenched his jaw. The words hit him harder than he expected. They failed him. It was the truth. But would they admit it? The state's attorney, a young man who hadn't been there when Elijah was convicted but was now defending the case as if he had, adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge certain irregularities in the handling of Mr. Hayes' trial, the evidence against him was—" The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." The room went silent. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Then she turned to Elijah. "Mr. Hayes, you've spent over a decade fighting for this moment." Her voice was calm, but there was something else there, something almost human beneath the weight of authority. "I have reviewed all submitted evidence, including the recanted testimony and the procedural failures in your case. It is clear that there was a miscarriage of justice." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The judge's eyes met his. "Your conviction is hereby overturned." For a moment, Elijah didn't move. The words hung in the air, fragile, almost unreal. He had imagined them so many times, prayed for them, fought for them, bled for them, but now that they were here, they didn't feel real. Then Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it. "You're free, Elijah." The first thing he noticed when he stepped outside was the air. It smelled different, lighter, as if the weight of Blackridge had finally fallen off his shoulders. The sun was warm against his skin, and for the first time in 12 years, there were no fences between him and the world. No bars, no walls, just sky. Just freedom. He heard a sob, and before he could react, his mother was in his arms. Lorraine Hayes, the woman who had fought for him even when the world turned its back, was holding on to him like she would never let go. "My baby," she whispered against his shoulder. "You're home." Elijah squeezed his eyes shut, breathing her in. She smelled like she always had, like home. Ava was next, his little sister who wasn't so little anymore, her face wet with tears. "I knew you'd make it out," she whispered. Elijah pulled her close. "I had to, I promised." Maya stood nearby, arms crossed, that watching with a small smile. "Don't get too comfortable," she said. "We've still got work to do." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" She nodded. "You're not the only innocent man sitting behind bars, Hayes. What happened to you? It's happening to a lot of people." Elijah looked back at Blackridge, the prison that had nearly broken him. He thought of the men still inside, men who had become his brothers, men who would never get a chance like this. Not unless someone fought for them. He turned back to Maya, his jaw tightening. "Then let's get to work." The world outside Blackridge Penitentiary was both familiar and foreign. The streets still hummed with life. Cars honking, people laughing, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the city air. But for Elijah Hayes, it felt like stepping onto another planet. 12 years had passed. 12 years since he had walked these streets as a free man. Now he wasn't sure what freedom even meant. The weight of Blackridge was still on his shoulders. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, the way some crossed the street when they noticed the way he carried himself. Shoulders tense, eyes scanning his surroundings, always ready for something to go wrong. He wasn't paranoid. He was conditioned. Because the truth was, even though the system had finally admitted its mistake, even though a judge had overturned his conviction, it didn't erase the 12 years they had stolen from him. It didn't give him back the life he lost. And now, he had to figure out how to start over. The first thing Elijah did was visit his mother's house. The small brick home in East Haven was exactly how he remembered it, worn but standing strong, just like her. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he walked up, a reminder of childhood summers spent running in and out of the house, never thinking for a second that one day he'd be locked away from it all. Lorraine was in the kitchen when he stepped inside, her back turned as she stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of seasoned chicken filled the air, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. "Ma," he called softly. She turned, eyes wide, and then she smiled. That smile, the one that had kept him going in his darkest moments, was all it took. In an instant, she was in his arms, holding him tight, whispering prayers of gratitude against his shoulder. "My baby," she murmured. "My baby's home." And for the first time since stepping out of Blackridge, Elijah felt like he truly was. But being home didn't mean things were easy. Finding a job as a formerly incarcerated man, even one who had been proven innocent, was damn near impossible. "You have any work experience?" one hiring manager asked. Elijah forced a smile. "Yeah, spent the last decade studying law." The man raised an eyebrow. "So you're a lawyer?" "Not yet." "Right, well, we'll call you if something opens up." They never did. Rejection after rejection piled up, each one stinging more than the last. It didn't matter that his conviction had been overturned. People still saw him as an ex-con. And then there were the whispers, not from strangers, from people he used to know. Old friends who didn't know how to act around him anymore. Neighbors who spoke in hushed tones when he walked by. Employers who nodded politely before tossing his application in the trash. It was like being in prison without the walls. He was free, but not really. Not yet. One night, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal books Maya had given him. "You should go to law school," she had said, passing him a thick textbook. He had laughed at the time. "With what money?" Maya had just smirked. "With the same determination that got you out of Blackridge." Now, sitting there, flipping through the pages, he felt something stir inside him. She was right. He had spent 12 years learning the law, not because he had to, but because he refused to let the system break him. And now he had a choice. He could spend the rest of his life trying to convince people he wasn't a criminal, or he could make damn sure that no one else went through what he did. Law school was a war. Not because of the workload. He could handle that. Not because of the long nights studying. He was used to those. But because he was surrounded by privilege, by students who had never known what it was like to sit in a cell for a crime they didn't commit. They didn't know what it was like to feel the weight of the system pressing down on your chest, suffocating you. He sat in classrooms where professors spoke about the law like it was some untouchable force of nature, as if it had never failed, as if it hadn't almost killed him. But he didn't let the anger consume him. He used it. Every case study, every legal precedent, every loophole that had been used against him, he devoured them. Because he wasn't just trying to get a degree, he was trying to change the system from the inside out. And when Maya came to visit him one afternoon, she found him buried in books, notes scattered across the table. She smirked. "Told you." Elijah chuckled. Yeah, you were right." She sat down across from him, sliding a folder toward him. "What's this?" he asked. She leaned forward. "Your first case." Elijah's heart stopped. "What?" Maya nodded. "You're still in law school, but you can assist on real cases under a licensed attorney. And this case, it's another wrongful conviction." Elijah's fingers tightened around the folder. A familiar burn settled in his chest, the same fire that had kept him alive all those years inside Blackridge. Another man, sitting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. He knew that pain, that hopelessness, and he knew he was meant to fight against it. So he flipped open the folder, scanning the details, and just like that, his real battle began. The courtroom was alive with tension, the kind that settled in your bones, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel like a risk. Elijah sat at the defense table, fingers interlocked, his pulse steady but charged with the weight of what was at stake. The man sitting beside him, Jamal Carter, 36 years old, father of two, had spent the last 9 years locked away for a crime he didn't commit. A robbery gone wrong, a convenience store clerk shot in the chest, and a desperate prosecution that needed someone to take the fall. Jamal was that someone. And now, after months of digging, after finding the missing surveillance footage that the police had conveniently misplaced, after proving that the key witness had been pressured into identifying Jamal, Elijah was here. Not as an inmate, not as a man begging for his own freedom, but as a lawyer fighting for someone else's. He took a breath. This was his moment. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket, the fabric unfamiliar but fitting him like a new skin. Elijah Hayes, defense counsel, ready to proceed. The words tasted like power, like justice, like home. 3 years earlier, Elijah never could have imagined himself here. Even after being exonerated, after finally walking free, the world had tried to push him back into his place. A place of quiet survival, of keeping his head down, of being grateful for whatever scraps life threw his way. But Elijah didn't come out of Blackridge Penitentiary to be quiet. He came out to fight. And so he had thrown himself into law school, surrounded by students who had never seen the inside of a cell, who learned about the justice system from textbooks instead of scars. He had studied harder than any of them because for him, this wasn't just about a degree. It was about redemption, about changing the system that had stolen 12 years of his life. And now, that fight had led him here, to the birth of Hayes and Reed Law Firm, his name beside the name of the man who had saved his life. Malcolm Reed. The day Elijah walked back into Blackridge, he wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit. He was wearing a suit and tie. He walked past the guards who once watched him like a caged animal, past the steel doors that had slammed shut behind him so many times, past the men still trapped inside, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Because he wasn't just another former inmate coming back to visit. He was coming back as their attorney. Malcolm Reed, his mentor, his friend, the man who had taught him how to fight with his mind instead of his fists, was still in there. 15 years into a life sentence. A sentence Elijah knew was just as unjust as his own had been. And now, it was his turn to fight for Malcolm. "I told you I'd come back for you," Elijah said, sitting across from him in the visitation room. Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. "Didn't think you'd do it wearing a damn tie." Elijah smirked. "You taught me everything I know. You really think I was going to let them keep you in here?" Malcolm studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled. "You're different," he said quietly. Elijah leaned forward. "Nah, I'm exactly the same." His voice dropped lower, steady. "I just finally have the power to do something about it." Hayes and Reed started with nothing. No big offices, no high-profile clients. Just two men who had spent too much time in prison for crimes they didn't commit, determined to make sure no one else went through what they had. They worked out of a tiny rented space in East Haven, their desks covered in case files, their phones ringing with calls from families begging for help. And they never said no. Wrongful conviction cases were the hardest to fight. The system hated admitting its mistakes. Prosecutors would rather protect their convictions than seek the truth. Judges would rather uphold old rulings than acknowledge injustice. But Elijah knew what it felt like to be left behind, and he refused to leave anyone else in the dark. One by one, they took on cases no one else wanted, and one by one, they won. "Your Honor, the defense requests an immediate ruling based on newly presented evidence." Elijah's voice was steady as he faced the judge, standing before a courtroom that had once been his prison. He had laid it all out, the hidden footage, the coerced testimony, the truth that had been ignored for almost a decade. Jamal Carter, sitting beside him, barely breathed. The judge, an older man with deep lines on his face, adjusted his glasses and let out a long sigh. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking at the man who had spent almost a decade behind bars for something he didn't do. There was a pause. Then, "This court finds that your conviction was wrongful and is hereby overturned." The room exploded. Jamal broke down. His mother cried into her hands. The sound of relief, of justice finally being served, filled every corner of the courtroom. Elijah let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all in his chest. He turned, locking eyes with Maya, who stood at the back of the courtroom, watching. She gave him a small nod, pride in her expression. He had done it. another man free. But Elijah knew better than anyone. This fight was far from over. The halls of Black Ridge Penitentiary smelled the same, a mixture of sweat, disinfectant, and something heavier, something that had no name, but Elijah had carried with him for years: hopelessness. He walked through the familiar corridors, his polished shoes echoing against the concrete floor. The guards barely acknowledged him this time. They knew who he was now. Not inmate 48217, not just another statistic swallowed by the system. He was Elijah Hayes-esque, a man who had escaped this place and then came back, not in chains but in a suit. Not to serve time, but to serve justice. But today was different, because today he wasn't here to represent a client. He was here for Malcolm Reed. The visitation room was colder than he remembered, or maybe he was different now. Malcolm sat across from him, the same knowing smirk on his face, the same sharp eyes that had once seen potential in Elijah when no one else did. But Elijah saw something else now: the years. Time had crept into Malcolm's face, etching lines deep into his dark skin, threading silver through his short-cropped hair. 15 years locked away for a crime he never committed had stolen pieces of him. But not all of him. "Look at you," Malcolm said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Sitting across from me in a damn suit. Thought you said you'd never wear one." Elijah smirked. "I thought I'd never be a lawyer either." Malcolm leaned back, studying him. "So what's the verdict?" Elijah reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the table, tapping it once before sitting back. Malcolm hesitated before picking it up. His fingers traced over the seal before slowly breaking it open. The paper inside shook in his hands as his eyes scanned the words. Appeal granted. Conviction overturned. Immediate release ordered. For a long moment, Malcolm just stared at it. His throat worked, his fingers tightening around the edges. Then he exhaled a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "I'll be damned." Elijah leaned forward. His voice was steady, but his heart was hammering. "You're getting out." Malcolm blinked, as if his mind was still catching up. He stopped, rubbing his hand over his face. When he looked up again, his eyes weren't just sharp anymore, they were wet. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. He had been on the other side of this moment before, knew what it felt like to hear those words, to realize that freedom was real again. Malcolm let out another small, breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn, kid." He looked back at the paper, then at Elijah. "You really did it." Elijah met his gaze. "We did it." Malcolm held his stare, nodding slowly. Then, for the first time since they had met all those years ago in the prison yard, he reached across the table and clasped Elijah's hand in his. No words needed. They had already said everything that mattered. The day Malcolm walked out of Black Ridge, the sky was open and endless, the sun beating down like it had been waiting for him. Elijah stood outside the gates, leaning against his car, arms crossed. When Malcolm stepped through those doors, free for the first time in 15 years, he paused, looked up at the sky, breathed in air that didn't belong to the prison anymore. Then his eyes found Elijah. Elijah grinned. "Need a ride?" Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. "Hell yeah, I do." As he climbed into the passenger seat, he exhaled, his hands resting on his lap. Then, after a moment, he looked at Elijah. "What now?" Elijah turned the key in the ignition, the engine purring to life. He glanced over, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Now," he repeated, shifting into drive, "now we change the world." And that, my friends, is the incredible journey of Elijah Hayes, a man who refused to let injustice define him. He could have given up, he could have accepted his fate, but instead, he fought back. He turned pain into purpose, and now he's changing lives, one case at a time. But here's the real question. What about you? How many people do you think are sitting behind bars right now, just like Elijah was, innocent, forgotten, waiting for someone to fight for them? How many times have you felt trapped? Maybe not in a prison cell, but in a system that feels impossible to break free from. And most importantly, what are you going to do about it? Because here's the truth. The system doesn't change on its own. It changes when people like Elijah, like you, refuse to stay silent. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you believe justice always prevails, or do you think the system is still broken? Let's talk about it. And if this story moved you, don't leave without hitting that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this. Because trust me, This is just the beginning.